Okay, we're going to talk about how to call ArcGIS functions. ArcGIS, of course, has tons of functionality in it. I mean, it's probably the single biggest collection of GIS functions available in one application. It also does cost $10,000 for the full version that we have here at HSU. And so I know a lot of folks either won't have it at home, or if you're on a Mac or Linux system, won't work. And if you go to work for a nonprofit, or individual consulting, of course, you're going to have a hard time affording $10,000 for the package. So I don't do too much of it in class anymore. We used to do a lot more. And Esri's also made it much harder to develop for ArcGIS than they used to. So I'm pretty much just going to cover it this 1 week. And if folks have questions, let me know. Okay, so first off, and what we're going to cover is just calling ArcGIS from Python. Used to be we could build applications internal to ArcGIS, and I can show you how to do that. We can still do simple plugins, but we can't do the stuff we used to be able to back in Arc 8. They've removed the internal Visual Basic environment that we used to be able to work in and do all kinds of cool stuff in Arc. But again, they've really limited what we can do as developers, which I don't understand why. It's too bad. But that's the nature of the beast. The good news is we have all kinds of other open source opportunities to be able to use. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So first of all, everything I'm going to do here will be in ArcGIS Pro. ArcMap is going to be going away here in the future. Esri's made that clear. I understand some of you aren't going to be able to get to ArcGIS Pro on your local computers, or even ArcMap if you're on Linux or a Macintosh. Feel free to use the virtual lab for this. It will have ArcGIS Pro on it, so you can use that. If you really want to use ArcMap, which some of you may go to work for an agency that's still using ArcMap, it'll be around for a few more years. The one thing you really need to know is that you need to go to a different location to get the Python executable to set inside of the Wing IDE. For ArcGIS Pro, we'll be using this one. And you really want to make sure you're using that one, and I'll show you what I mean. If you go into Project and Project Properties, you may have it just set to default. That's what you typically want because that'll pick up the installed version of Python. If you have more than one, then you want to use this, I don't know why it says command line, it used to say custom, but you'll see this path here. And how I got that was by going to this PC, C, Program Files, and this is on the web, ArcGIS, Pro, bin. Now, notice there's a Python install right here. Don't pick this one. It doesn't work. One more, Python. Then we go into EMVS, ArcGIS Pro. They really buried it. Python, yay! And now there's Python. Okay, so notice that's going to be a different version of Python than we've run in the past. It is a custom version from ArcGIS. It's very difficult to install libraries that Esri hasn't provided with it, so that's one big problem. And it's also very difficult to go between ArcGIS and other versions of Python. So we're just going to stay within ArcGIS, which is what I recommend you do. And if you work in an ArcGIS shop, in other words, everybody uses ArcGIS, that's pretty much it. This will work pretty well for you. You may get frustrated that there's a lot of other software out there that you won't be able to use, a lot of transforms, but that's the nature of it. What you can always do is write your ArcGIS, your Python scripts that talk to ArcGIS completely separately from your scripts that talk to the open source or other libraries that you need, and then you run one and then you run the other one. It's not as nice as we'd like, but it works. Okay, so one thing to know is the way to get to ArcGIS is called ArcPy. That's the library. We need to import that. And then under ArcPy, there's a number of other libraries. In particular, I spend a lot of time in spatial analysis tools. That's the raster processing functions. And then there's ArcPy analysis, which is the vector processing tools. So these represent really the bulk of the toolbox that you've been using in ArcGIS. So all those toolbox functions, most of them are available from Python through one of these two libraries. Okay? And the biggest challenge with ArcGIS is getting the function, the right library, the right function name, and the right parameters to do what you want to do. Now there's some also other ones you may want to explore. You can get to mapping, so you can actually get to MXD documents, and you can even create maps through Python using ArcPy. And then you can get to the management stuff as well for coordinate systems, tables, things like that. So most of the functionality in ArcGIS, except for the GUI, okay, the graphical user interface, is available to you through ArcPy in one way or another. Okay, so calling ArcGIS from Python. So I'm just going to go ahead and I've downloaded this tiny dem. This is one for all of Humboldt County. I recommend using the tiny one first because it'll go really fast. And I'm going to copy and paste this code into a new file. And then I'll go ahead and walk you through what it's going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import ArcPy, okay, the Python library. Then we're going to check out an extension, in this case spatial. Remember how in ArcGIS we've got to go in and enable the extensions? Well, this is the same thing. We're just doing it through Python. Now, when you run ArcGIS, you can't override an existing file, right? You've got to keep doing new names to it. So if you write out a slope raster and then you didn't like that one, you have to do another one. You do slope 2, 3, 4. You can set, this is the environmental variables. You can set overwrite output to true. Then you don't have to do that anymore. You can just run your script. It'll write out your slope raster. And then if you run it again, it'll write another one and overwrite the one that's there. Now you have to be a little bit careful with that, right? Because if you take your input and you accidentally overwrite your input with your output, that's going to be a bit of a problem. So it's a little dangerous, but it's also really handy to be able to do that, because we do tend to run these scripts over and over again as we're developing them. Just make sure your input is different from your output. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and step through this. One of the reasons is just to let you know, the ArcPy import takes quite a while. You can see it's sitting here for quite a while. No one knows why, but it takes a long time. And then the rest of it's pretty quick. And I've set up an input path. Oops, wrong input path. Let me go ahead and make sure I correct my paths. Okay, just going to do the shift, copy as path. Paste that in, and my image name is aspect.image. Got to do a little bit of fix up here with quotes and slashes, of course. Same as we've always done. Okay. And now notice, whoops, I did the wrong one. I want to get the elevation file. I almost did just what I told you to be careful and not do. I almost overwrote, okay, my input with my output, or vice versa. Okay, so there's my tiny elevation file. We're going to stop and rerun. And then we're going to go ahead and save that out. Need some music. Okay. And you'll find these are slower than the open source ones. Again, we don't really know why Arc is so slow. It's a little bit confusing. But yeah, the whole program is just slower in general, which isn't as big a deal when you're in the GUI as you're doing things one at a time. You may be more annoyed with it with Python if you're doing a bunch of stuff. But the advantage is here we can also just walk away from it if it's doing long processing. Okay, that was pretty quick. Done. We've written out our aspect. Of course, I already had this, so I might go ahead and delete that. Aha! Still open in Python. So this is one of the things you'll fight regularly. Notice my program is still active, right? I haven't fully terminated. So it hasn't loosened up. It hasn't freed up this image. So now I can't delete it. You won't be able to display it or do anything with it. So I need to let my program finish. And it's actually Arc that's hanging on to it. Esri and Excel, remember I mentioned that. They both love to hang on to everything. And I'm going to go ahead and write that out again. And what we're going to talk about for the rest of this video, almost all of it, is going to be this right here. So notice that says arcpy.sa.aspect. That's ArcPy, so the library for Esri ArcGIS interface. It's also called an application programming interface, or API. Okay, .sa, that's spatial analyst, so that's the raster functions, .aspect. So we're going to ArcPy, to the spatial analyst library, to the aspect function within there. Okay, and that's pretty cool, But there's some challenges to figure out where we need to be with that. Okay, so let's see. If we go to the next one, you'll notice this talks about the flavors of ArcGIS 10, and this also applies to ArcGIS Pro. So the basic goal here is to try and figure out how to get to ArcGIS functionality from Python. And what I recommend is go into ArcGIS, load up the data that you're interested in, actually do the function that you want to do. So like in this case, go ahead and do an aspect transform. Now it doesn't really matter too much where I put this or what I do with it. Okay, I am going to just write it back out again. Okay, the aspect4.img, I'm going to run this. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because it makes sure that all my files and paths or everything are good and there aren't issues with my data. And now, if I want to automate this because I want to do this 100 times over, I can click on this question mark. And notice that takes us to the web. It takes us to the ArcGIS Pro help for the aspect, also known as the 3D Analyst tool. Okay, it's in 2 different places. Anyway, we'll talk about that more in a sec. Because notice it's available with 2 different licenses. I tend to use Spatial Analyst. It's also available with 3D Analyst license. So 2 different licenses to access this. Now, the reason going this way is important is because if you just search on the web and you type in ArcGIS aspect, okay, there's a really good chance when you go in here, you're going to end up in ArcMap or another version of ArcMap. This is 10.3. There's a lot of Esri documentation out there on the web, so make sure you're on the right one for the version of Arc software that you have. So there aren't a huge amount of differences, but they're small, and you can get really frustrated if some little error won't tell you what it is, won't go away. So then here's all the stuff about how to use it. Good documentation, we like it. And then here's the syntax. Now notice, this looks really different. And you might think we could use that to call Arc, but you can't. I don't know why that's there because you can't have a library start with a 3. So careful with their documentation. Usually Esri's documentation is really good and really accurate, but that's just strange. So I don't know why that's there. Anyway, the rest of it is pretty good, and we'll come back to it because it has things like the input raster, the output raster, so these are the paths for the input and output, and then the method and all the other documentation you need to be able to call it. More important down here are the code samples, okay? Now, another thing that's really important is notice that this says the Python window. Inside of ArcGIS is a little Python window that basically is just debug.io, or really the debug console. Okay, this is what they give us for $10,000 is this little debug console, not this cool IDE with all this other functionality. I really don't recommend programming through the Python window because, ouch, it's really hard to do stuff. And you'll also notice that the functions are named different. So if you go down here, you'll go to standalone script. That's what I recommend. That's what I just wrote, is a standalone script. In other words, something outside of ArcGIS, which means it's outside the Python window that they provide. And I guess I can show you really quickly. Oh, wait, there it was. Darn it. Analysis. There it is, the Python window. There it is. There's the Python window, and mine doesn't even seem to be working, probably because it's mad at me. Oh wait, no, we can do something here. X equals 12. Print X. Oh yay, that's all you can do. I don't recommend it. And there's whole books written on how to develop with Python using that little window. What I recommend is what we've been doing in the past. And now here you can see, here's code for a standalone script. We can actually copy and paste this, okay, into a script. Boom. All right, now, a couple things to notice. One is the imports are different. ArcPy and then from ArcPy, env. Well, that's okay. Then they're going to change the workspace. So you can have a default folder that's used for all your data processing. In effect, that's the same as our input path. Now, I tend to not use this because I always seem to be having folders in different places, and I'm pulling data from one folder and processing it, putting over another one. So I don't tend to use that workspace, but you can if you want. Now also notice it has an elevation without an extension. If you're using this as an external script, that is going to default to the grid format, which is not something that we use. So I don't know why that's in help. In other words, there are some little issues that are going on in help. So let's just go ahead and replace that. And then we'll make our output aspect, we're up to about 4.img. And you can change the method in the unit. Now notice it also tells you, these are in caps, they got double quotes on them, so it's a string. So the examples have some really good information for you about how to run this. Now let's go ahead and give this a try. Okay, it's going to do our import, so there's going to be a bit of a pause. Oh, and I should have mentioned, notice it's checking out extension 3D. Now I wouldn't put this here, I'd put it up at the top, kind of get it out of the way, because I'm going to move this code around a little bit as well and make it a little bit easier to use. I think I'll pause until it's done. Oh no, it did, it finished. Yay, okay, and there's our aspect 4, and you could load this up somewhere and take a look at it. Now, what I would tend to do is I would tend to do this. Check out my extensions up at the top, and I tend to use SA instead of 3D. Okay, and I'll show you why in a second. Use the workspace or your own temp, okay, either way. Now, this just seems strange to me, right? I don't know why they would put those in separate variables. I would probably do this. And also, especially if you set the workspace, you can just do this, right? That'll do the same thing. And now what's happened is, check it out. Now we just have a couple lines of code to do aspect. And this is handy, especially if you're going to be doing a whole bunch of processing one after the other, calling it in the toolbox. Just like we do with SpotPy. In fact, this is where the inspiration for SpotPy's one-line functions came from, is you can just stack these up, and so your program doesn't get too big, and it's pretty easy to read and see what's going on. So this is how I would convert this, okay? Now, one more thing. Notice we used 3D here, and over here, I'm going to undo that. We used sa.aspect. This is another confusing thing about the Python library. So if we type arcpy.aspect, aspect 3D, so there's the aspect function. If you type .sa.aspect, there's another aspect function. These two, as far as I can tell, are exactly the same code. Can't guarantee it, but there's an awful lot of places where there's multiple versions of what looks like the same function, and that's a little bit confusing. I recommend sticking with SA for now until you get used to it. Same thing is true for, if we do arcpy.buffer, there's a buffer and a buffer analysis. But if we do .analysis.buffer, there's a buffer. So the same thing is true when we're doing vector transforms. So again, a lot of the challenges with Esri is figuring out, or with the ArcGIS products, is figuring out what the functions are that you want to call. Now, once you get the function that you want to call, the next step is to figure out the parameters. And we already took a look at the parameters here, and this will help, you know, but it's like, well, I know it's a string. Okay, string because it says it there, so I need to put these in quotes. And sometimes these are a little bit hard to figure out. Like here's this, but it says Boolean. So I'm not sure how to make that a Boolean. So this is where quite often it's the examples that will help you. And when the ArcGIS help doesn't help, you can go back on the web and look for stuff. It's a bit of a challenge, just want to warn you ahead of time. But again, a lot of functionality, and the help is pretty good. The other thing you can do is if you go over into Wing and you click on Aspect, Over here is something we haven't used a whole lot, but we're going to start using a lot more. And that's, oh, take a look. It shows you the parameters and the documentation for what's in aspect. And I found a few errors, not a lot, but a few errors in Esri's help. I've never found errors in this documentation. Okay, so notice here, in raster. So there's the in raster. Now, okay, not the easiest documentation to read, but still pretty cool. The input surface, okay? And then there's the method, okay? And then there's the Z unit. Notice that that other one that was Boolean isn't even here, so I don't think we're going to worry about that. Okay. Okay, but these can help figure out what's going on. Now, the other thing I should have mentioned is notice that this function takes an in raster and an out raster, method and a Z unit. This function takes an input raster, a method, and a Z unit. Where's the output raster? Well, this one returns the output raster. So this function is a little bit different from this one. So instead of doing our output raster here, we're going to need to do that. Whoops. And then dot save. Okay. And let's try that. And while that's running, I'm going to flip over here and make sure I have the right syntax for save. Yeah, I just want to make sure that's a small letter. Okay. All right. So, yep, there's that. So, if it doesn't have a call for the output, parameters not valid. Data set cannot be overridden since overwrite option is disabled. Well, that's because there's already one out there. So let's call this 12 because I know I'm not at 12 yet. I won't run it again to see if we can get it working. Okay. So again, you check here, no output raster, it's returned. Here, input raster, output raster. So different flavors of functions, different flavors of parameters. This executed. We got out our raster 12, there it is. So we're good to go. Okay. All right, and I think, code snippets in the results window. Okay, so the other one that's important, the other way you can get good information on this is, remember here, we went ahead and ran our elevation and we did a raster output, okay? So after you've done work in ArcGIS, you can click on history and it will show you a history of what you've been doing that day. So here's our aspect tool that we ran. You can see the input and the output raster and the settings for it. Great. More important is you can do copy Python command. Okay. Then we can go to Wing and we can paste it. So if you're having trouble figuring out what the command is, okay, or the function call and what the parameters are, go ahead and execute the tool that you want to do in Arc. We've got Esri's toolbox help, which we can get to from the little question mark. We can get the Python command, and we can also get the source assistant information over here. Okay, now this one I need to talk a little bit about, because notice, what the heck is that, right? There's this DDD thing. Oh, look, there's another aspect. So one of the things that's happening, we don't know why, is Esri keeps adding different versions of libraries in different places. So you'll see things like this. Now, I think that's the same as the SA one. So I think we can just change that to SA. Don't worry about the R. That's just changing this to a different string format. You can leave it or remove it, your choice. We do, of course, have to fix our slashes. And I'm used to running without the R, so I'm just going to take it out. And then again, we get planar and meter. So this is another method for you to be able to get a function that'll work and the parameters. Just remember, you've got to do a little bit of work to figure out exactly what's going on with it. Okay, Then there's a bunch of other information out there. There's a lot of books on programming with Python. They don't usually use an IDE. They use that little window, but that's okay. Again, it's really about finding those functions and other methods for how to dive into the Esri toolkit functions. All right.